Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Selena Oliver. I am a nationally certified school psychologist, and I'm here today with my colleague, Kara.
Hi, I'm Kara Canali. I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist.
Great. We're very excited. We're here today to talk about how you can use your DALS library to help with eligibility, uh, prescriptive and diagnostic decision making. There are so many different tools that you have as part of that library. And we've just kind of discovered that not everyone's aware of what they have access to, or maybe how they can pull those tools together to help with their situation. So the DALS is a great opportunity to look at a bunch of different things. And to this end, Kara and I thought what we would do is maybe just present some case studies where we could talk about how we've used these tools. So I'm going to be presenting one, and Kara's going to be presenting one. So the first one's going to be Toby. He's a 9-year-old boy who has a medical diagnosis of ADHD, but he receives special education services, or he received services as a student with other help and care. And then after that, we're going to talk about Evelyn, who is 16, and she is struggling with attention, anxiety, some social issues, some behavioral issues, poor school attendance. And so we're going to cover the tools within the context of those two cases. Kara, do you have anything you want to talk about before we get started?
No, Selena, I'm really excited to hear about Toby. I'm always really curious when a student has one of those determinations of other health impairment based on attention deficit or executive functioning disorders. To me, this is one of those real murky classifications. On one hand, it seems self-descriptive. A child with problems with attention may have attention deficit disorder, but poor attention is really symptomatic of so many conditions. So it really warrants a deeper dive, and not only for classification clarity, but also for prescriptive clarity.
I mean, if you think about it, the determination of ADHD is really predominantly focused on symptoms of inattention and impulsivity. Of course, there are a lot of other factors to consider, like planning difficulties, organizational issues. But we know that um, inattention is one of those symptoms that really is expressed a lot by during those A disabilities. So those disabilities like autism, anxiety, achievement, ability, affective disorders, and other associated disorders. And so kids with autism may be inattentive to classroom instruction because they're hyperattentive to an area of interest for them, and therefore they ignore the relevant instruction that's occurring. Or kids with anxiety might be inattentive because they're worried about what's happening at home and they can't focus on math, on a math lesson.
You're right, Selena. I mean, likewise, kids with affective depressive disorder may be inattentive as part of that depressive symptomology that interferes with their ability to concentrate and motivation. Or kids with OCD may be preoccupied with their obsessive compulsive symptoms. Children with Tourette's syndrome may be focusing all of their energy on really trying to manage their tics, especially in the school setting. This is what I really like about the breadth and the depth of the tools in the dolls, is that it really lets you explore all these so-called lookalikes when you need to.
You're absolutely right. And we know even with kids who have ADHD, that they often have some of those comorbidities. They may be very anxious about trying to navigate their school day because they tend to be, they miss social cues, they may miss instruction. And so that's really going to put them at risk for having social faux pas or being anxious and worried about their academic achievement. So we tend to see a lot of kind of commingling, comorbidity, and crossover symptomatology as well.
Right. And because of that interrelationship between all of these A's, it may be really difficult to really get more classification clarity, but we can certainly get prescriptive clarity. Once we understand some of the causes of inattention and how they're related, those associated causes or comorbidities, it's a lot easier for us to then intervene and come up with a really appropriate planning for those students. So, Selena, let's see what you can tell us about Toby.
That's great. Thank you, Kara. So Toby's 9 years old. In this scenario, we're at the end of the third grade year. He was previously evaluated in kindergarten. At that time, he was, as I mentioned earlier, had a medical diagnosis of ADHD. and was then began to receive services as a child with other health impairment. This time around, I think I would like to use the BASC, structured developmental history, to get a little bit more detailed information. So I don't know if any of you have used the SDH. It's part of that massive BASC family. Like, most people are familiar with the BASC rating scales, but really there are 11 features of the BASC that can be accessed. One is just even beginning with your assessment, the structured developmental history. It uses adaptive logic to help you move through all of that background history. The beauty of this is that your parents can complete it as they're kind of going along at their own pace. It uses adaptive logic, so it's quicker and it's cleaner, right? So it's going to eliminate fields that aren't relevant based on the parents' previous answers, or may add fields that become relevant based on the answers. And then you have all of that in a way that you can pull that information, cut and paste it, type it into your broader report, so that you have really some good, accurate information and everything is covered. So for Toby, these are his results from his first year of being assessed. You can see he was given the WISC-5, and all of his scores are average or better. So his standard scores range from 91 to 103. His scaled scores range from 8 to 13. So at the time, nothing really seemed remarkable with this. Then we look at his achievement test. So he was given the KTEA-3. And again, everything here looks really pretty good. The scaled scores range from 91 all the way up to 132. There are no areas of deficit. And based on that, so based on the WISC-5, based on the KTEA, the team didn't really feel that a specific learning disability was in play. They did, though, give the BASC, because remember, the Toby was having some behavioral problems. I didn't go into this in too much detail, but when he was young, he lived at home with his parents. He's an only child. He didn't have any type of preschool experiences, no structured activities, but he was very smart, right? He was very inquisitive as a child. He learned to read very early. His numbers, his letters, was really very prepared for entering school. And so that vast structured developmental history really helped me understand that. But once he got into school, again, that achievement testing looked pretty good. His cognitive testing looked pretty good, but he began to have some behavioral issues. The BASC was ultimately given, where you can see the hyperactivity scores both at home and at school were somewhat elevated, some conduct problems at school, some atypicality, withdrawal, and attention problems, depending on the setting, were just beginning to surface, but definitely the hyperactivity and the attention percolated. And when we look at that executive functioning scale, that content scale for executive functioning from the BASC, you can see that both at home and at school, those scores were really the most prominent. So pull that up with kind of ruling out that specific learning disability, seeing that even on the cognitive test, right, if you look at this, the lowest area was really these working memory processing speed that we sometimes associate as being somewhat characteristic of kids with attention deficit disorder. So based on that, parents decided to take him to a doctor for some medical, exploration. They did an assessment, and based on that, they determined that he was eligible for services as a student with an attention deficit disorder and other health impairments. And so they decided not to provide any real specific intervention. They were just kind of waiting around maybe for some maturation, for him to adjust to a structured school setting, and to see what would happen with that. Kara, what do you think? So based on that information, do you have any suggestions for me this time
Well,
around?
Selena, maturation can certainly remedy a lot of those early delays that you were talking about, but there have been times, I've certainly advocated for that approach when educational supports and the frequent monitoring are in place for a student like Toby. Hmm.
Okay. So what would you recommend for me?
At this point, I think I'd gather more information during this reevaluation, determine if and how that executive functioning is still impacting Toby in the classroom. And I definitely want to try the BAS-3 structured observation system. This can easily be done with your smartphone or tablet. The observations completed in 30-second time sampling over a 15-minute period. There's a built-in timer and screen prompts. It really makes it a very easy task for the examiner. The SOS has three parts. Part A is a behavior key and a checklist that analyzes the time sampling of behavior. Part B consists of time sampling of these 71 behaviors in 14 different categories. And Part C records factors in the classroom that would either sustain or extinguish those behaviors. I'd also check in with those familiar with Toby, and I'd have them complete the Connors 4 and the Brown Executive Functioning Assessment. We're very excited to announce that the Connors 4s are now available on Q Global and is also available as an optional add-on to your digital assessment library through our MHS platform. Connors 4 provides a comprehensive assessment of symptoms and impairments that are associated with ADHD and the common co-occurring problems and disorders in children and youth aged 6 to 18 years old.
So, Kara, I'm curious. You'd mentioned that you would maybe utilize both the Connors and the Brown executive functioning. What's your rationale for that? In some ways, to me, they seem like they may be redundant.
Yeah, I can see your position, and I think that let me point that out for you. While both tools provide great information, they approach executive functioning differently. The Connors uses a very traditional approach that primarily focuses on the frequency of those behaviors, attention and hyperactivity symptoms. It also includes some brief screening of anxiety, depression, and emotional dysregulation. So they're all helpful as we're trying to, tease out or parse out those competing A theories. On the other hand, the Brown executive functioning uses 6-domain algorithm that explores the severity of symptoms. So we were talking about the Connors and the frequency. If you think of the Brown and really think of the severity of the symptoms as opposed to frequency within situations and situational variability. The 6 domains include activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action. That emotion domain can be informative when considering whether inattention is impacted by emotional functioning, such as anxiety. So by utilizing both, you get a very clear picture of severity, frequency, and the situational factors there.
Cool. You know what? I wonder too, Kara, if what you might think about the children's version of the California Verbal Learning Test. So this is a test that I really love. I find it very powerful. It gives me a lot of good information that I can share with teachers and parents, but also with the student to help a child understand what their learning style is. So for instance, if they're better with recalling things, if they're using a semantic clustering strategy, I think that's helpful. Or if you're working with the students having some behavioral issues and you're working on that FBA and that behavior intervention plan, and you really want to give some very specific language-based instruction or directions to kind of redirect and manage behavior, it's important to know a couple of things. Is the child going to remember that instruction if it was delivered first? Or are they going to remember it better if it's delivered at the end? Or what is their learning slope? Like how many things can they actually remember and recall in any specific set of instructions? So I feel like if the kid knows, they can internalize how they learn, they're better able to advocate for themselves. The CVLT is available for kids from 5 all the way up to 17.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I think you're right, Selena. At Toby's age, he can begin to recognize and really internalize those learning strategies so that he can carry them with him. To check out planning and organization, I think you'd probably want to administer some of those NEPSI subtests like inhibition and animal sorting. I'd follow that up with trail making and the Tower subtest from the DCAPS Advanced. As you know, the use of a behavior rating scale in combination with those performance assessments are really going to offer you the most comprehensive assessment of functioning. I'm also cognizant of the evolution of Toby's struggles, and I'm wondering when you had talked about him earlier, um, if some of this could even be related to autism spectrum disorder. So I noticed from your 6-year-old data that you said Toby had really high letter word identification and less developed reading comprehension. So perhaps, maybe that hyperlexic good skills for rote task and rote activities, it's really not uncommon in young children who may be on the autism spectrum. Those students often will do well in first and second grade where the skills are being asked are very rote and lend themselves to that particular strength. Whereas once the focus of education becomes more abstract, third and fourth grade, we begin to see, this involves a lot more reasoning and sometimes academic and behavioral difficulties can start to emerge. The BAS-3 is especially informative. The T-scores for hyperactivity, attention, executive functioning certainly support his current identification. However, the scores for atypicality and social skills, adaptability, withdrawal, emotional self-control, developmental social disorders would probably warrant further exploration. These are reported to be pronounced in the school setting. So to this end, I think I'd probably want to employ some of those more narrow band assessment tools in the digital assessment library. I'd want to look at the sensory issues that are contributing to his inattention and possible agitation. I would use a sensory profile too. This behavioral section is going to allow me to explore conduct, social emotional responses, and attentional responses associated with sensory processing. Next, I'd like to give the Self-5 metalinguistics. This tool starts at age 9 and includes subtests of making inferences, figurative language, multiple meanings, and conversation.
Here, you probably already know this, but the Self-5 metalinguistics is one of those tests that can be administered in Q Global using a digital stimulus book model. So basically, the digital stimulus book serves as the easel, and then you can score using the forms from the DALS package as well. This tool, I think you already mentioned, it starts at age 9, and I find it to be a really helpful adjunct to some of our other assessments.
Yeah, that's really good to know.
But speaking of some of our tools and that DALS library, the other things that we might want to consider are if you're going to do the social perception tests. So if you use that DALS library and purchase the NEPSI 2 kit at 65% off with free shipping, then you're able to look at those social perception tests like theory of mind, which would look at the ability to understand mental functions and another person's point of view, or affect recognition, which is the ability to recognize affect. So speaking of the DALS library and the print piece, I like to think of DALS Complete and DALS Print as equaling DALS Plus. So the DALS Complete is going to give you that access to the digital components via Q Interactive or Q Global, while the DALS Plus Print is going to give you access to print materials such as the record forms for those select tests that are not on Q Interactive for 65% off of all the DALS Plus print kits, and also all those DALS Complete print kits as well. And then also free shipping on related materials.
That's great. Yeah. Okay, so back to Toby. Once the Autism Spectrum Rating Scale joins the DALS platform, it'll become a no-brainer, Selena, to add that tool as well. The ASRS manual and printable rating scales will be available in the Q Global Resource Library soon. And administration options will include on-screen administration, remote on-screen administration, and of course, manual entry. The ASRS is really going to allow us to explore all those other areas that are really part of that symptomology of an autism spectrum disorder. Social communication, unusual behaviors, the regulation piece, the peer socialization piece, atypical language, the rigidity, attention, all of these are really relevant to your referral question with Toby. And going back, Selena, to that BASC 3 form, did the kindergarten team use the BASC intervention report or the score report?
So they only use the score report. But now I'm thinking with access to the DALS library, I really have access to really any type of report option that's available in Q Global or Q Interactive. There are tons of different report options. They're all included, so there's no, nickeling and diming for different report types. So you have your basic score report, which is what you might see with the RAML, where you're going to have your basic scores that are reported. But for the BASC 3, for example, that report that has intervention recommendations, I love it because you can see the detail here. What I love about this is that it's going to look at my students' data, right? It's not just generating a kind of a global set of recommendations. It's really looking at my student data and it's pointing out some things like, Toby maybe one of his areas of primary improvement might be hyperactivity and depression. And maybe there's a secondary area in leadership and attention problems. Or maybe he even has some adaptive skill strengths to bring to the table to resolve some of these issues. And you can see here that the report gives you very specific interventions that are evidence-based, that are tied specifically to my student data. So I can feel really confident in pulling out that recommendation and sharing it with the team or family, or again, even with the student himself. That WISC-5 interpretive report provides great considerations that you're not going to get with your standard score report. So again, it's going to look at kind of the big picture of the student and provide an interpretive report section that's a little bit more detailed and then that can lend into some better recommendations. Multi-rater reports are also very common and prevalent in the reports that involve rating scales. So for example, in this scenario here, we have both parents completing a rating scale, and we do recommend that parents complete separate rating scales. And the beauty of this is that since you're not having to burn money on extra reports or extra forms, you can really avoid kind of that undesired thing of having two parents complete the same report. We know when that happens, you don't usually get a good representation of how each parent is viewing the student. Maybe the parent is, or the child is in different households at different times. So it's really important that each parent provides their own perspective. And because you have unlimited access to these tools, you're able to do that via this multi-report process. This can include comparing the information to student responses as well as educator responses. And again, maybe having different educators who contribute separately on separate reports, right? So no team completing a rating scale. Each person should complete their own scale. You can really get at that information and see what are the variables. Maybe it's the time of day, maybe it's a certain personality characteristic, or maybe it's a subject, but you're not going to get that if the raters are contributing on a kind of a group expression of a rating form. So these multi-rater reports will look at and compare that information, but allow each setting and each person to make their own expression. And then we know with anything we do, if we're recommending any type of intervention, we want to be able to take a look and see, has that intervention been effective? We want to maybe have multi-time comparisons, and you can do that. So just with this particular sample, I put out the brown, you can compare time 1 to time 2 and get whether that change is significant. And maybe there's some things that have occurred during that time to might explain either an improvement or unfortunately, if there's a challenge. And then there are sub-tests that lend themselves to comparing one test to another test, right? These are especially common in our tools that share norms. So like the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, 5th edition, and the Expressive Vocabulary Test, 3rd edition, they share the same norms, and you're able to compare those tests with each other. Other tools that we can compare might be the WIAT and the WISC-5. Now, they didn't share the same norms, but you're still able to make some comparisons that I think are helpful. And then finally, some of our tests have parent reports that are specifically written with the parent in mind. So it tends to use more lay language tends to address things that may be of more concern for a parent as well. So I love all of those report options. I think that's one of the beauties of this reporting system, is just being able to have access to so much information that I really can just really have something that I know is very valuable and trusted at my fingertips.
Selena, I love that you pointed out, just the ability for a clinician to give as many rating scales as they need with the digital assessment library, especially at the secondary level where a student might have multiple teachers, or you're looking at, giving one to multiple caregivers. The beauty of the DALS is you can give as many rating scales and have them come back as you would like versus the paper and pencil. So I think that kind of opens the door to clinicians just being able to use their professional judgment in a different capacity, which is great. And even though you're going to get those specific interventions in your reports you were talking about, did you know that you have two great intervention sources in your library? The Basque Intervention Guide and the Basque 3 Behavioral and Skill Building Guide. Both of these are available in the resource library on Q Global. One resource is geared to the clinicians at the individual student level, while the other tool is really designed for a more global intervention model targeting small groups or even entire classrooms, which is amazing.
Yes, I'm embarrassed to say it took me a while to figure out what the differences between those two were, but once I figured that out, these were really some go-to resources for me in the school setting, whether, especially if I needed, again, like something that I knew was going to be specific to my student, or maybe I had several kids in a classroom who were demonstrating the same particular challenge, and I wanted something that could be done globally, that also allowed me to have some good strategies to share with teachers, or even, other healthcare providers, even healthcare providers like a school counselor or social worker who may be wanting to work with students in a preventative way, with lunch approach or whatever. So yeah, these guides were a real gem to discover and find.
Totally agree. Well, we need to wrap up with Toby, but one final thought after you get your new results, Selena, if there's a social, behavioral, or emotional component, did you know that you can also use that BASC 3 Flex monitor to gauge effectiveness of your intervention, even on a weekly basis, which is amazing. The Flex monitor can be used to monitor the behavioral and emotional functioning over any desired period of time. This allows you to, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, Kara, it sounds kind of technical. Can you explain it to me in a little bit more detail?
It does, but it really just allows you to create and psychometrically validate, which is basically like a miniature BASC if you think about it, just taking a few of those critical items in one domain that can be administered really quickly and repeatedly.
Okay. So if I have this chart, then I can really see if, like in this particular example, the student has improved and moved into my goal zone. So that could really support the service that I'm already providing, or intervention that's already occurring. Or maybe I have one of those situations where the team is considering that maybe the student needs more restrictive placement. And then this data would be helpful for me to kind of justify that as well, if it's not going in the direction that I want.
Right. And I think, Selena, just that word, the data that you just mentioned, right? We're always kind of stepping back and saying, is this intervention effective? Are we seeing progress? And when we have actual points that can actually be used in a data model like this, I think it's really helpful to step back and be able to look at that data and make decisions based on what we're seeing happening for the student.
And it's good to be able to just even show a graph, like you get the immediate understanding of what's going on when you have a graph like this that you can show. So I think that's really super awesome.
Yeah, I've used it at the secondary level with students directly to show them, sometimes they're not even seeing, they don't feel like they're making progress. And to be able to have a graph like this, right? Like that's just such a nice visual.
And when we think about like those small approximations of achievement that you don't necessarily get if you're doing an assessment every 3 weeks, every 3 months or half a year, like this with this weekly monitoring, there's really a way to kind of hold on, like, yeah, I'm making progress a little bit at a time. But look, in just 1 month here, I've made huge progress, which you might you might not necessarily pick up on that if you're not assessing very frequently. Feel like I do have a lot of tools now to use that I hadn't thought about before, but I am a little nervous, Kara, because now I have access to all these tools, some of which I've heard of, or maybe I've seen reports come from other examiners or private practitioners, and I want to learn more, and I need to know more myself so that I can be competent with these tools that I now have access to. And so I know Pearson has a lot of great self-service training tools, because all the manuals are included on Q Global, Q Interactive. I certainly have that as a resource. We know that we have a lot of training videos, sample reports available to us, webinars, but I feel like maybe I might need something more. I might want something more to share with my colleagues so that we're all on the same page. What do you think?
Absolutely. And, I'm really glad that you asked about that, Selena. Pearson really envisions our tools being used with integrity and competence. We appreciate it when examiners take the time to really develop that professional competency with these newly accessible tools. So, training really offers the opportunity to establish that consistency within your department, and just get you really comfortable using all these wonderful tools that are at your fingertips in the digital assessment library. So, I would highly recommend that you ask your assessment consultant about training opportunities. We offer webinars, even live on-site options. So, it's really worthwhile. Selena, I really enjoyed talking with you about Toby, and I want to present to you a student that I would like to get your insight on. Um, I'd love to get your thoughts on a student named Evelyn. Evelyn is a high school student that was referred for an initial evaluation. She's 16, 11th grade. She's moved around a lot, has pretty poor school attendance. It looks as though previous school districts attempted to put some interventions and supports in place for her, but she usually moved again before a whole lot of data could be collected. Her teachers believe she's bright and capable, but she's not putting forth a whole lot of effort in school. She's usually sleeping or doodling and doesn't really participate. Her initial evaluations that I've collected so far show that she's average to above average cognitively, a little bit of a relative weakness in her working memory. Academic skills seem to be average.
Okay. So, Kara, it sounds like there's a lot to unpack with Evelyn. And of course, we know as our students age, we have a lot more data that we need to sort through to get a big understanding of the evolution of what may be going on. You said she's new to your district also, so you probably don't have a lot of information, even about what type of instruction she may have missed out on or has done. So it sounds though that like initially you and your team have ruled out the possibility of a learning disability. But I'm wondering, because you mentioned memory, if you feel like that has been a big enough area of concern that you would want to do some further assessment in that area. And also, like, are you looking for more assessments that might help you look at these referral questions that you have here, emotional disability, other health impairment? And you have those parent teacher student rating inputs, or scores that you can share with us.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I did want to evaluate a little further into her memory skills to really tease out, is it attention, concentration? Is it truly a deficit, a cognitive processing deficit? So to further evaluate that, weaknesses in memory can often be attributed to things like attention, concentration, even emotional factors, right? But I'd like to get the data. So with younger students, I would always give the RAML, but with students 16 and up, the WIMS 4 has been a great option. It's available in QI in the Digital Assessment Library. This is an individual administered clinical instrument for assessing that immediate, delayed, and recognition memories across both auditory and visual modalities, as well as visual working memory. So Selena, fun fact, the WIMS 5 is launching in a few months, just June of this year. So for those DALS members, this new assessment will automatically load into your library, which is really great. The WIMS 5 was co-developed and co-normed with the WACE 5. So for those students 16 and up that you are looking at a WACE, you can also give the WIMS. They're co-normed. That really expands, allowing comparison of the performance across those two tests. It's got flexible administration options. There's also a a mental status screener, immediate memory screener. There's a short form. It's really great. There's a lot of information there that I think is really helpful when you're trying to tease out if memory is indeed a cognitive deficit that you'd like to get some more information on. So I would definitely recommend the WIMS.
Right. And I think you said this starts at age 16. And I know for some of our students are beginning to age out at 16 from special education or beginning to graduate high school. But I know there's still a lot of states out there that continue to provide services for transition as
Absolutely.
students are going to move out of the school setting into a work environment or, secondary education opportunity. And there are even some districts who provide services up to age 27. So I do
Wow.
see this as a very valuable resource in addition to the library. I'm glad that Pearson opted to include that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And great point, Selena, about those students that are with, the districts a little bit longer. I think the nice part about WIMS too, it's actually providing some information in terms of, the comprehensive memory assessment, the visual memory versus auditory, that information can also be easily translated into their IEP goals or what's appropriate for them as they transition based on the strengths and weaknesses within the WIMS. So it's great data. And again, I love that it's co-normed with the WACE.
Especially like in Evelyn's case where you're really trying to parse out, is this her executive functioning, those expressions of executive function, are they really an attention deficit disorder, or maybe there's some type of memory deficit here? So I think this is again just a great addition for Evelyn.
Agree, yeah. And as far as the social emotional, we certainly, I certainly felt that I needed to dig a little bit deeper there. When you're looking at the social emotional learning edition, the SSIS of the SSIS, this is a norm reference behavior rating form. It's really quick. It can be completed in 10 minutes or less by a parent, teacher, or the student. And it provides those different viewpoints on the social emotional functioning of a student. So I did administer this to Evelyn. My concern with her was in the area of her relationship skills. It was very low, percentile rank of 1, which falls in the well below interpretive range. So yeah, so this was a good place to start.
Yeah, so I can definitely see those scores that you just shared with us indicating some significant problems with her in forming relationships with others. Some of it might be her insight into her own behavior, her own feelings. Students with scores like that may struggle communicating with their peers, can often be viewed as uncooperative, and they may need a lot of support with their relationship skills. One of the things I like about the CASEL or the SSIS Castle Aligned version, SEL, is that it really is looking at a set of strengths. And so when you're a student completing those questions, they are talking about strengths and assets and not focused on deficits. I think it can be just much more comfortable initial screening into social emotional behavior that kind of is welcoming and can send that message to the student that we're looking for positive things. Self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, relationship management, all very important.
Yeah, I agree. The BASC-3 also has that behavioral emotional screening system. So that's something that's designed to quickly and efficiently access, to assess the behavioral emotional risks and the overall mental health status. That's great for kids ages 3 to 18. And you can administer and score that either by hand or online. It can also be emailed to parents and teachers. And scored through Q Global. So that's really great. It really identifies those areas that are at risk, which I think is really important when you're talking about some mental health concerns.
So, Kara, the screeners that we just talked about, the SSIS SEL screener also has the full rating scale component, and the BAS-3 has this best screener, and then also the full rating scale component. I'm wondering, so especially with the best here, like if I'm working in an environment where maybe I have a self-contained classroom of all kids who have social emotional needs, this might be a great way just to get some type of class-wide information about where they stand so that I can better then provide maybe a class-wide intervention. And also, since this ties in with those VASC intervention guides that you shared earlier, I think that's a great pairing that's going to allow me in those specialized settings to really provide some great services to our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost always include a BASC. As you know, it's just such a great broadband emotional assessment that was completed by Evelyn's teachers, her mother, and she also completed a self-report. And all raters indicated clinically significant levels in depression, anxiety, somatization, and basically those internalizing symptoms. In addition, attention and withdrawal scales were also elevated. So I found the BAS-3 to be really helpful in answering the IDEA emotional disturbance eligibility questions. As you know, that's such a heavy classification, and emotional disturbance is that, it's exhibiting one or more of those following characteristics over a long period of time to a marked degree, adversely affecting a child's educational performance. Each of those EDQs, those emotional disturbance questions that are part of that, they're aligned with the constructs of ED as represented in that IDEA definition. So it really helps to provide context to those questions, which again, when you're talking about a classification like that, I think it really helps to kind of give you more data and further support that identification in that category. But there are a couple things, Selena, you got to keep in mind. The BAS-3, those EDQs, they reflect the new combinations of the BAS-3 scales, and they're grouped to align with those constructs. And these constructs serve as the minimum criteria used to determine a student's eligibility for special education under those federal rules. However, while they're really useful, the EDQs, in conducting those part of that comprehensive psychoeducational evaluations, those scales are really designed to match the criteria, but they don't answer the why, right? So you really have to dig a little deeper to figure out why the student is behaving the way that they do. And sometimes students who may meet that criteria for ED based on that behavior could be better characterized under a different disability, right? So when their behaviors are better accounted for by that other disability, that could be an example of ADHD or even autism spectrum disorder. Nearly all students with ADHD may have inappropriate behavior under normal circumstances, which is one of those prongs, right, of the ED diagnosis, the ED identification. So, examinees with autism spectrum disorder will, often have difficulty building and maintaining appropriate relationships with peers and teachers. So just when seeking the most appropriate school placement for an examinee with autism spectrum disorder and ED indicators are also elevated like that, it's really going to be important to discern whether the qualifying behaviors are in addition to the autism or directly caused by the autism. So this determination is really best accomplished through a really detailed history and probably a clinical interview in the context of this really comprehensive evaluation.
Yes, Carrie, you make some really good points. I like the phrase you use, better accounted for by a different disability. And that really does become so important because, again, on the surface, when we're looking at students and we're just looking at behaviors and symptoms, it's real easy to jump to a conclusion, just like we talked about with attention. Well, it could be anxiety, it could be, another affective disorder, it could be OCD, et cetera. And if you don't have kind of maybe the right take on it, you're not going to have the right intervention. And I really see this happening with kids who may have these elevated EDQs, if there's not that broader discussion or deeper assessment to figure out why these behaviors are occurring. A great example of the ones you just mentioned, autism is a perfect example, but even say a child with an intellectual disability. So think about that. They're going to be struggling many times with understanding communication, understanding social rules because of their cognitive ability, which is going to be much younger than their peers. They're going to look immature and they're probably going to get frustrated in situations. And so that behavior is going to surface and it can be really tempting to say, well, this is, the child has emotional disturbance on top of an intellectual disability. But just think that if you're focusing mostly on that emotional disability perspective and you're not addressing the intellectual disability and the child ends up in a placement with other severely behaviorally impaired kids who don't also have the intellectual disabilities, you're really setting that child up for failure because in some ways that behavior they're addressing is typical for their intellectual age. And so you really do want to make sure that you're able to address it appropriately. This has all been very good discussion, especially when we talk about like the battle of the A's, right? That whole concept of there's so many disabilities that have similar expressions of behavior that it can be a real challenge to figure out what's the one major contributing factor, but there could also be multiple factors as well. So the BAS, I agree, is a really great tool, especially as one of those broadband measures for identifying additional areas that might require some intervention. But what are your thoughts about the Beck Youth Inventory Second Edition? The BYI2, it is a set of 5 self-report inventories which look at anger, depression, anxiety, disruptive behavior, self-concept. So these are all independent rating scales beginning at age 7. They can be used separately, takes between 5 and 10 minutes for each one of those, or 30 to 60 minutes collectively. It could also be administered individually or even in small groups. So again, going back to maybe that self-contained classroom where you have several children who all need some type of intervention, but you really want to be able to kind of zero in on what's the best kind of whole group type of thing we might be able to do in addition to meeting those individual needs. Some of these scales could be, I think, very helpful for that. Each scale has about 20 questions or statements that are going to reflect thoughts, feelings, behaviors that we typically associate with behavioral, social, emotional impairments in children and adolescents. And I just gave you a mouthful.
You read my mind, Selena. The Beck inventory was something that I had immediately thought of in administering to Evelyn, and as you might have guessed, she was clinically significant in the areas of self-concept, depression, anxiety, and just average on anger and disruptive behaviors, but we're not seeing disruptive behaviors in Evelyn in the classroom setting. But, I really like the way the Beck also highlights the critical items within each area. So given the nature of those items, I think it's really important to be able to address those critical items immediately if a student is considered to be at risk in those areas.
Agreed. So I'm glad you found the Beck Youth Inventories helpful for Evelyn. And I know you said you're working on the concept, the idea that maybe working memory could also be a relative weakness. The DALS library includes some assessments that you might find beneficial in this case. We've already talked about the Connors, we've already talked about the Brown, but are you familiar with the DREP? So in terms of executive functioning, the DALS rating of executive functions is a set of rating scales designed to assess executive functions in kids and adolescents between the ages of 5 and 18. What I like about the DALS is that it's going to identify patterns of clinically relevant symptoms and provide clinical indices in areas of attention working, memory, activity level, impulse control, compliance, and anger management. And it's also going to give 4 indexes for behavioral, emotional, and executive functioning. To me, it's really useful in being able to identify symptoms that are creating the most stress for the student, the parent, the teacher, the classroom setting, and to really help with that intervention planning. The 3 core indexes and a total composite score are based on behavioral, emotional, and cognitive functioning. There are also 4 second-level index scores that you can use to identify patterns of clinically relevant symptoms. Just like some of our other reporting options we talked about, there are single rater options, multiple rater options, and progress monitoring options to help you look at those changes between two different administrations for the DREF.
Thanks, Selena. This is a new assessment for me, and I'm really excited to try that and see what clinical information I can add in for Evelyn's evaluation. I mean, that's what's so great about having access to the digital assessment library is that there's so many pertinent, relevant assessments for clinicians to access based on their referral. The other thing I was thinking while you were going through talking about the DREF is, sometimes as a clinician, you might get maybe a private evaluation, or you might have, other assessments that have been already given, and you want to look at something that looks at similar symptomology, but you don't want to necessarily give the same assessment. So I love that there's options when you're talking about these different categories. There's, options that maybe you want to give something a little bit different, but you also are still trying to assess some of the same symptomology.
Sure. And one of the other things I like, Kara, is that let's say I receive an outside report that I've not done the DREF and I'm not familiar with it.
Mhm.
Well, I have access to the DREF. I can go and look at those manuals, see the questions, and just have a better understanding then of what that report is telling me.
Yeah, great point, right?
Yeah. Well, look, we're very close to our hour. I want to go over maybe two more tools that we haven't talked about a lot in detail. And the first is this Milan family of assessments. I just pulled out the Mackey here. What I really love about the Milans is that those reports are just crackerjack. I hope you guys have a chance to read this while I'm talking, but it's going to give you kind of an insight into the internal thought processes, which are triggering those observable behaviors that we've been rating, right? So if you read some of this language, so, for instance, let's say this were with Evelyn, there are irrational and bitter complaints about being victimized, but yet at the same time, she feels like she deserves to be blamed. Or she's being treated unfairly by her peers, but yet she'll constantly demonstrate behaviors that push her peers away. So just kind of being able to read these reports and understand like the child's thought processes as they're making some of these decisions, which can be, spur of the moment. I find these reports to be very valuable. I'm not going to give them in every situation because they can be very lengthy, but they really do help me when I'm trying to justify additional counseling services, or maybe I'm in a position where I have enough information and this tells me the child is just really not a good candidate for counseling at this moment. So students who this might be helpful for would be students coming back from a psychiatric hospitalization or incarceration, or maybe a student where the school district is considering a more restrictive placement, maybe a private, totally private placement, or maybe even a residential placement. These Mackey reports are just going to be really super crackerjack helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like gold. I mean, when you're getting that kind of clinical data, like you said, not for every student, but when you're looking at some of the severe emotional cases and some of those, like you said, is it appropriate for counseling? Is the student, are we looking at maybe another alternative setting? So that's great. That's another assessment I'd like to learn more about. I also like to give the parent relationship questionnaire, Selena. As you know, parents are just so critical to a student's success. And by the time you have a student, especially at the secondary level, and they've moved through maybe a residential placement or, a more restrictive placement, possible hospitalization, or even incarcerations, that parent-child or even parent-school relationship has often become strained, right? So I think the BASC parent questionnaire is going to provide us with an opportunity to really identify the breakdown there and the strengths too in the various relationships, depending on, what they may be. Perhaps the parent has viewed the school as being, incapable or deceptive or demeaning, or perhaps the parent perceives the student as being too demanding, or they're stressed by that relationship. The questionnaire is not an evaluation of the parent. It's not, a clinical assessment of the parent. It's just really an assessment in terms of what the strengths are in terms of that relationship, so a parent can help to bring support to the student regardless of what environment the student is in.
So here's some other tools we didn't talk about a lot. Well, we didn't talk in any detail really about the RAML-3, but that's a great assessment of memory and learning. The RBANS update is another tool that's available to you. And then the California Verbal Learning Test, 3rd edition for the older students as well. So we are out of time. I think we have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to just kind of while Becky's queuing up some questions for us, I want to mention that we have 2 other webinars in this series. One is to simplify your OT and PT assessments with those DALS digital tools. That will be Wednesday, March the 19th. And then also the digital assessment library for schools using those achievement tools. So we know we have at least six achievement tools and DALS. So there's a lot really to parse out there. Becky, do you have anything for us?
I think you guys have done such a great job, and there aren't a ton of questions in our chat box today, but I do have a question as a speech pathologist. I know you're both school psychs, and you guys today have provided a plethora of different resources to us in the seminar. So can you speak a little to how these tools can contribute to collaboration with related professionals? So like how can we as related professionals collaborate effectively with school psychs and other team members to really support our students with ASD? And can you speak a little bit about how you are using these tools to effectively do that?
Sure, Kara, if you don't mind if I jump in, because the perfect example that comes to my mind is the Self-5 metalinguistics and the other the other language assessment tools. Just really trying to parse out are some of the language and behavioral components related to that social communication disorder, or are they related to an autism spectrum disorder? And so when I look at the Self-5 meta, look at the other cognitive tools and collaborate with my SLP about their self tools, I think that's, that's a great example. I can keep going, but I want to see if Kara wants to take a crack at any of them, but I have some more ideas for sure.
Yeah, no, thanks, Selena. I think what you just said to collaborate with your SLP, right? So especially when you're doing an evaluation where there's multiple clinicians involved, whether that's OTs, PTs, speech and language, there is overlap in some of those assessments. So when you're talking about, especially like atypical language, right? That could be something that both a speech language pathologist and a school psych might take a look at. So it kind of falls, I think there's a little bit of overlap, but definitely collaborating with those other professionals conducting, those multidisciplinary evaluations.
One last thing on collaboration with an SLP is whenever I would write a behavior intervention plan, I always have communication strategies. So some of that information I get from like the sensory profile, or I get from some of our other tools. But that's where really pairing up with your speech language pathologist to look at the mean link for veterans or other communication strategies is going to be so critical for making sure you have a very successful behavior intervention plan. And so I see that we are out of time. I would like to thank everyone for participating and attending. And Sherry, are you still on the line? Do you want to close us out? Right, so for those of you who attended, you will receive an email not too long after this.
Oh, Selena, I'm sorry. I was on mute. I was talking. Well, I'd like to thank both of you for sharing your expertise with us and thank everyone for their participation. Please leave your browser open for action items that will pop up. Look for your certificate in your email within 3 weeks of today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and this does conclude the webinar.